I think our leader,
Let's get it going. We've got such a great committee video to show. It's coming up. Smash the like, hit subscribe, consider a membership. This channel is getting ready to go.
to Poland, but they are from a country that's not a neighboring country to Poland, should they be allowed to come in here and be a refugee?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Because we
I think our leader, Trudeau,
Ready to go, gang. Getting ready to launch. Hey gang, what's up? Just Aaron right here, Canadian Looney. So, yeah, Canadian politics, man. Nothing quite like it. Thank you all for tuning in. Patriots. We're patriots here. We care about our country. What in the hell is going on? Let's take a look. We take a look in context. In context. Because we're not trying to fool anybody. Show the people what is happening.
I think our leader, Trudeau, I don't
go.
think I've ever heard him say a true word.
Oh, hello. Do you have a warrant to be here?
It's time for a change in this country, my friends. A real change.
Wiggle and squirm as you might, it is really hard to put lipstick on a pig.
When I'm Prime Minister, I will keep my promises. WTF.
Here.
I know this place is where I am. No other place is better. No matter where I go, I am proud to be Canadian. I am, you know I am. The worst that works.
We've got one wonderful show coming up right away, guys. Like, stay tuned. These committee investigations are crazy. We've got a couple of things to show before that, but we're going to get into a crazy committee investigation. It happened just this afternoon. It's wild. You want to be informed? Like, subscribe, share, get notified, all those fun things. Here we go.
High Commissioner and 5 other Indian diplomats as persons of interest in the killing of Sikh separatist leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar in British Columbia last year. India's response to these allegations was to withdraw the diplomats. It was then followed by Canadian government's move to formally expel them. Adding now, the Indian High Commissioner to Canada said that Trudeau's decision to blame India for Nijjar's killing, it was based on intelligence information rather than concrete evidence. My name is Hem Kaur Saroy and I'm being joined by Mr. Brahmachalani, Professor of Strategic Studies at the Centre for Policy Research, to understand where the bilateral relationship between the two stands at the moment as the Rouse spirals. Mr. Brahmachalani, thank you so much for joining us on Way On.
Thank you.
Now, sir, to begin with, I'm sure you're aware of the comments made by the Indian High Commissioner to Canada. He's blamed Trudeau for wrecking the ties between the two and in fact has even called out Western hypocrisy in his comments. What's your take on this?
Let's look at the broader picture first. The Khalistan movement is virtually dead in India. But it appears that some security agencies in the Anglosphere countries, especially Canada, US and the UK, are seeking to revive Khalistan militancy in India. Because as the High Commissioner, Sanjay Verma, said, that Khalistan extremists and terrorists are, quote unquote, deep assets of Canadian intelligence. Some people, for example, believe that Panun, who's based in New York and who's been designated by India as a terrorist, is a CIA asset. The question is, when these individuals based in Canada or the US make terrorist threats against India. Pannoon, for example, has again, he released a video a year ago, last November, saying that his goal was to balkanize India, and he warned people from flying Air India. Today, he's again released a message asking people not to fly Air India between November 1st and November 19th. And this is from US soil, he's making these threats. And yet there's no action against such individuals, which raises the question as to whether these individuals, these militants, are assets of certain security agencies that are using them to leverage.
What do you think of this work though? He's saying the Prime Minister should step down. What does that say about the Prime Minister's leadership?
Look, I'll speak for myself. I'm a member of his cabinet. Obviously, we support him. I think the work that we're trying to do to help Canadians is really the main focus right now. We're up against somebody who's campaigning on promises to deny access to free birth control for women, who won't even get a security clearance to look into allegations about his own caucus members being engaged in foreign interference, who's opposing policies that are going to help build more homes. I know which side I'm on.
How can you do that work when half the people say
your colleagues about wanting the Prime Minister to step down? How does the Prime Minister continue to lead the party into the next election when there are MPs openly speaking about lack of faith in his leadership?
Well, I think these are not easy times to lead. I don't know anybody who's having an easy time anywhere leading. But the Prime Minister has my full confidence and the full confidence of most of my colleagues. And I think, you know, it's an easy time to kind of, you know, believe there are magic solutions. And Canadians are going to go through the same kind of thing, I think, whenever the next election comes. You know, you can listen that, you know, that a slogan, just the slogan can fix all of your problems. That's all you need is a magic wand. And that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in a new magical leader. It doesn't exist in a new magical slogan. These are difficult times, and they require careful deliberation every day, an enormous amount of hard work, and taking in all the stress in the world and trying to hold people. And that's not easy, and I think the Prime Minister is doing it well.
What do you think of this letter that some Liberal MPs allegedly are getting names and pledging to ask the Prime Minister to lead this position? What do you think of that approach?
I think, you know, one of the things I love about my caucus, and it's I was elected 20 years ago to this caucus, you know, is that it's full of opinions, and they're welcome to share them, and I think that's a positive thing. I think that's strong. I think having a debate as a party about our future and where we should go is something that I welcome. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a sign of a strong Democratic caucus. I haven't seen the letter. I guess they know my opinion on it, so I didn't get a copy of it. But I think, you know, these conversations around how we deal with the difficult times that we're in and how we try to find answers and how we try to lead are totally appropriate. So I don't mind my colleagues having these conversations at all.
But I have to say, the fact that you're saying right now only some or not even, can you say all of your caucus has confidence in the Prime Minister? I mean, how does that show that you have a strong caucus? It shows that there's a lot of division.
Well, but I mean, this is just an honest reflection of what's happening in every caucus at all times. I mean, I think that I don't look. If you guys watch, you know, different people come by in different political parties, and you know that some of them are closer than others to the current leadership or the current policies. There's always a situation where people don't have their perfect situation. That's being in a party. Like, you know, we have to be a team. So some people in the team are always going to be a little bit more or less happy with what's going on or what the situation is. We happen to be in a caucus where we're more open about those differences. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a positive thing. I think that gives us the opportunity to have real reflections, including asking the hard questions of when we're dealing with a world as complex and difficult as this, what's the right approach? And so I welcome those conversations.
Those who publicly call for the Prime Minister to resign should be expelled from caucus?
No, I think that, you know, I think that if you don't, ultimately, if they present a different view of our path forward, at some point in time, you got to say, okay, well, we're continuing this way. Your other colleagues don't agree with you. And then they make a choice about whether or not they want to continue on that basis and continue fighting into the next election. I mean, at a certain point in time, this has to resolve itself. I mean, I think that those conversations are positive and good, but at a certain point in time, you got to wrap it up and you got to come to a determination. And either we're going forward, or you're going forward with us, or you make a decision that you're doing something else, and that's fair too.
Should it be put to a vote? Should it be put to a vote?
Well, it doesn't need to be, because I mean, look, every single one of us is expressing an opinion, and caucus, just like the process of governing, is about building consensus. And if that consensus is not present, it's pretty evident.
One of the lowest debts, Poland.
This is Dominic, a member of the European Parliament from Poland, the country that just approved a new measure to shoot and kill anyone that tries to illegally enter their border.
Unfortunately, one of our soldiers was killed with a spear.
Because they behave like animals, unfortunately. They don't behave like civilized people. We are the ones with this border. So we are protecting the whole Europe.
But Poland's strict border control and refusal to take in refugees from non-neighboring countries like Syria and Afghanistan has caused the EU to propose a €22,000 fine for each person Poland refuses to take in, and guys like Dominic to be labeled Islamophobic and fascist.
And Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission President, says that you're racist. You sound proud of the fact that you haven't taken any refugees.
Of course, because this is what our people are expecting from our government. That's number one. This is why Poland is so safe. I don't care. I care about my family and about my country.
When I see the wall, I do understand that this is for my future children.
Does Poland's strict border policy work? Is Poland significantly safer than the rest of Europe because of it? And do the people of Poland want open borders?
Poland are racist. We are proud of it. And I don't really want any immigrants in my country, you know? Thank you, man.
Before meeting with Dominique, I headed to the capital of Poland, Warsaw, to see what the locals thought of Poland's border and their border patrol now being able to kill migrants illegally trying to enter their country.
At university, what are a lot of the students' thoughts on, shooting down illegal immigrants who come through the border?
I've never heard about it.
Okay.
But yeah, okay.
It is bad because I don't see any purpose to use a gun for the person. First of all, we need to talk. We need to identify the intention of the person.
Oh my god, that's a tough question.
It's a crazy question, right?
Yeah, but to be honest, I'm not sure how they're controlling the borders, but I saw a lot of refugees in the Centrum here.
There are a lot of immigrants all around Europe, and sometimes it can be dangerous for the Europeans.
What are your thoughts on if you came here illegally? What should be done?
Oh, I guess I should go to prison.
Do you feel safe here in Poland as a woman?
Yeah, very much.
Do you feel safer here in Poland as a woman than you do in India?
Yeah, it's more safe.
Yeah,
it's more safe. A lot safe.
You can walk, go to work at night, and nobody cares, and nobody is threatening you.
It's not very safe.
No?
Really cross from the main streets.
Yeah.
I really feel not very safe because there are some strange people.
Here?
Yes.
Yeah, like men in general?
No, some sick people.
Okay.
They frighten me.
Who should the border keep here illegally? What should be done? Let in Poland?
I guess
Nice people, kind, and with good heart.
Okay. Do you think having a more strict stance on the border keeps Poland safer?
This is Kensington, Philadelphia, the center of America's drug epidemic overrun.
Okay.
I want to believe that it doesn't really matter from which country you're coming.
Okay.
If you apply to the culture, it's gonna be fine.
Safety has nothing to do with the border.
Okay, nothing?
Nothing.
What are your thoughts on immigration in Poland?
Я сам являюсь политическим иммигрантом, и поэтому не мне отвечать на этот вопрос. Я пока не сталкивался с какими-то негативными проявлениями в свой адрес.
Why did you come from Belarus to Poland?
Я политический активист, и обратной дороги в Беларусь мне на данный момент нет.
How was your experience going through the Belarusian-Polish border?
У меня чуть другой маршрут. Я прилетел из Грузии. Я жил в Тбилиси некоторое время. Поэтому в моем случае без экстрима обошлось.
Я считаю, что здесь женщине безопасно. И заниматься бизнесом тоже очень хорошо.
What are your thoughts on their stance on illegal immigration and the idea that they'll kill you if you try to illegally enter through the border?
Я считаю, по международному праву все страны защищают свою территорию. Но это на законодательном уровне. Никто из хозяев, если есть граница, существует, должны соблюдаться законные эти данные. Поэтому, если ты нелегально пересечаешь, ты территориальную целостность защищаешь. Считаю, что государство вправе применять оружие для защиты своей территории. Если ты бежишь от войны, пожалуйста, регистрируйся, получай документы, работай. Мне кажется, страна очень комфортная для жизни и, по-моему, очень толерантно относится ко всем беженцам. Я бежала от войны, и тем не менее за 2 года мы тоже здесь и открыли бизнес, и работаем, и платим налоги.
What are your thoughts on the border here in Poland as someone from Ukraine?
Fine. It's really fine. Yeah, it's no problem with service.
Was it easy to get here from Ukraine?
Yeah, really easy. Few hours
and you fled for political asylum, or you work here? Why did you come?
I work. Yeah, I work.
I believe like in most Poland, especially like the eastern part in Warsaw, we're like fully open for everybody who wants to come here in every purpose. A lot of people lost their houses, lost the safety in their life.
Yeah.
So I do not see any problem with that. In my opinion, I don't have any problem with that.
Even illegally?
You know what? In my opinion, it's just like hard to be illegally at this moment because you have to cross the border. I think this is not like the main spectrum of a problem. Most of them want to be illegally because they want to have a work.
So if they come to Poland, but they are from a country that's not a neighboring country to Poland, should they be allowed to come in here and be a refugee?
Yes, sure, because we've been in this situation in Poland. We have a trouble history, so we need a help for our neighbor.
What are your thoughts on illegal immigration?
I think the crime rate is going much higher so far.
So what about like Syrian refugees, like Afghanistan refugees, Eritrea? Are they close enough to be considered neighbors, or should they go to the neighboring country?
They're not like, of course, geographically they're not our neighbors, but if they looking for a safe place, they want to be here legally, they want to have a work, they want to build a new life, I don't see a problem with that.
Have you heard about the Belarusian-Polish hybrid war, they call it?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Of course, this is not correct. I mean, to allow or to bring people from outside just to push them in EU.
But before heading to the Poland-Belarus border to see what Poland says is a hybrid warfare at play where Russia is sending migrants from China and Africa into Poland for them to then enter the rest of the EU and then financially and socially destabilize the rest of Europe. I met up with Dominique, member of the European Parliament and Poland's Law and Justice Party. Is this man a racist, alt-right Islamophobe as the mainstream media and leftist detractors call him? I want to ask him, how does Poland's new border wall work? Can any refugees come in? What is this hybrid war? And how does their border control differ from other EU countries? And more importantly, does it work?
I'm very happy that we are on the street, not in the studio. You can see and everyone can see Japan. Yeah, the difference. It's beautiful.
Would this look different in Paris, London, anywhere in Germany? What are your...
We're going to cross into Canadian politics. This is a committee meeting investigation from today. It's wild. It gets out of hand quickly. We've got Dancho, Dane Lloyd, Melissa Lansman. Like, it's a tremendous committee investigation. Let's take a look.
We will be vigilant in looking for hands going up. With that, we will pass the floor to Ms. Stancho.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this sub-amendment. I will note, Mr. Chair, I find it a bit disconcerting that we're talking about this amendment and sub-amendment, this motion, amendment, and sub-amendment in general. Just given, certainly even just today, the latest news on the India affair, it would appear that Canadian officials, for example, I mean, this sub-amendment is interesting because it talks about protecting national security, which is obviously important. And today we learned that it would appear that national security officials in Canada leaked information to the Washington Post that Canadians weren't made aware of, that Washington Post journalists have apparently a greater right to know information about this India issue than Canadians. And I think that is something that we could get into if we were studying the motion that we all agreed to review the India affair and bring in various deputy ministers, the CSIS director, the RCMP commissioner, a number of security officials and other experts to testify on some of the information they know, when they knew it, and why is it that the Washington Post knew before Canadians. And I think that there's a number of issues, even just that aside, that could fill in a lot of the blanks of this important issue that I think a lot of Canadians are seized with, particularly Canadians in the Indian community, and particularly the Sikh community. And it just is a bit disconcerting that we're seeing various parties play politics with this issue. Our party's been very clear where we stand on this motion in particular. That's not going to change. And certainly I do feel that we could get back to the matter at hand, which I do believe all parties are interested in learning more about, particularly in light of the breaking news today out of the Globe and Mail from Bob Fife. And so certainly, Mr. Chair, I think we should be moving on and getting back to the study at hand. In particular, for example, if we were focusing on the study that we had passed as a committee, we could be asking the Commissioner today why it is that we had to learn from the Washington Post that the killing of an individual in Winnipeg has been linked to the whole India affair in general. Why is it that we had to learn in American news and that the RCMP didn't release that to the Canadian public? I would like to know that, amongst other things. So we could be doing that today. Instead, we're going to be focusing on playing politics. Unfortunately, this motion from the NDP, with presumably the Liberal support, we've made our position very clear on this, and that's not going to change. So I'd ask the other members of other parties to consider us getting back to the matter at hand so we can focus on the India affair. Certainly, Mr. Chair, I think that it would be worthwhile this committee to immediately take up that study. I don't believe we could get to that perhaps today, but I would assume on Thursday we could move to have, or we could certainly, you could do the work to have various witnesses come and testify. And certainly, if we're looking at this, I do feel that the sub-amendment in general, I think that would be overall, I do feel that is implied in it, but I do feel that perhaps moving it was not, in general, this motion was not in the best of faith. We've made our position clear, as I said, and I do feel that we could be focusing on the matter at hand. And I do believe that all members of this committee are intelligent and can fight their corners with respect and certainly have information put on the record that I think would be of public interest in the India affair issue. And certainly, Mr. Chair, again, just waking up today and seeing that we can repeatedly hear, for example, from the Prime Minister and others that all these issues are classified, we can't talk about them, and yet it just seems, again, I don't believe this is the first time, in fact, that we're seeing various members of the American or various news outlets in the United States getting information before we got it. I believe, if you'll remember, Mr. Chair, actually, when there was that issue of the Chinese spy balloon, American news had more information about what Canadian intelligence knew than the Canadians themselves. So this isn't the first time that we're seeing issues like this. And so when we're talking about protecting national security, I would wonder what processes were followed that the Washington Post journalists were entitled to some of this information and that we weren't. And I do think that is an interest of this committee, certainly as the Public Safety National Security Committee, and then it should be with haste that we have a number of these witnesses come to testify. Perhaps we'll have them testify more than once, given the importance of this issue. So certainly I know we'll go through this today, but we've made our position very clear on this matter. We do not feel that this motion reflects the best interest of the duty of the opposition to hold the government accountable. That is our position, and that's not going to change, Mr. Chair. So again, I'd ask other parties to consider that, and if we can get to work as soon as Thursday on questioning members of CSIS and the RCMP and others, I think that would be of great public benefit to further understanding the details of this India affair, Mr. Chair. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I ask that you put me back on the speaking list.
Thanks, Mr. Dancho. We'll go to Mr. Lloyd, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to echo the comments made by my colleague, Ms. Dancho, I think, or Mrs. Dancho. They very apt, disturbing that information was shared with a foreign media outlet, the Washington Post, before Canadians were made aware of the situation involving the allegations that a foreign government, in this case India, has been sponsoring acts of crime in our country, which is a concern of all Canadians when our sovereignty is impacted in this case. And I think, if the allegations made by the Globe and Mail are true, I think it illustrates a greater point, which speaks to the sub-amendment that my colleague, Mr. McGregor, put forward, where he talks about the release of the names must only be done in accordance with national security. And I'll say that at all times in my original sub-amendment, it's implied that We will not violate the safety of agents who are in the field in the release of any information. However, with the addition of this sub-amendment, I have concerns because it's clear to me that we have a government that feels that it can leak information if it's in their own political benefit. Information gets shared with groups like the Washington Post, information being leaked like the Prime Minister outrageously at the Hague Commission, selectively saying that he has information related to Conservative parliamentarians, which I think people in the media and across the country have rightly denounced and criticized as a blatant partisan act by the Prime Minister. We know from security officials that foreign interference is a broad issue across this country, and for the Prime Minister to try to weaponize information that he's privy to in a way that is vague really puts a cloud of suspicion over all members of Parliament. And frankly, I think it devolves this foreign interference debate into a partisan debate when it really doesn't need to be. And I think the fact is, and so we will call this out, we will hold this government accountable when they put their own partisan interests above the national security of our country. And we know that this is a Prime Minister who's facing an internal revolt. He's facing numerous pressures, and he's attempting to distract in any way he can by outrageously using selective information that is curated to solely benefit himself politically and not to benefit the national security of our country. And I will note that, this all could have been avoided. Our House Leader, Andrew Scheer, the Honourable Andrew Scheer, in the wake of findings from the NSICOP report that there were members of Parliament who were compromised by foreign interference, that Conservatives put forward a way forward that would respect our national security. In a letter that was put forward to Parliament, it was requested that the Hague Commission be given a broader set of powers and be given a broader mandate in order to, and receive the unredacted information needed in order to reveal, when possible, the names of members of Parliament or other parliamentarians, both current and former, who have been implicated in foreign interference. And I think it's only fair that that those members of Parliament that are involved be notified about this, because they're under a cloud of suspicion and they need to have the ability to clear their names if they are innocent. And Canadians need to be given a chance to, we're facing, there will be an election by October of 2025, guaranteed. And Canadians need to know that the air needs to be cleared, that our Parliament is free from these serious allegations of foreign interference. And, if this Liberal government had their way, Canadians wouldn't even know that foreign interference was happening in this country. We saw the lengths that this government went to hide this very serious information, the lengths that they went to even outright deny that foreign interference was happening. In the case of Minister Blair, when he came to this committee in his role as Minister for Emergency Preparedness, answering for his tenure as Minister of Public Safety, when he said that they had received no evidence that there was foreign interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections. This is the Minister of Public Safety saying this in 2022, and we now know from the Hague Commission and from information that's been shared in the public space that there was indeed foreign interference that affected at least 8 ridings in the 2021 election. And I feel very personally about this because one of those members of Parliament was a good friend, Kenny Chu, in Richmond, and his name was slandered. His name was slandered, and it was found to be agents of a foreign government that was using its arm in Canada and numerous assets in Canada to spread falsehoods that that Mr. Chu, himself a man of Chinese descent, was attempting to create a foreign agent registry that was going to list all Canadians of Chinese descent. A patently ridiculous idea and absurd, ludicrous, and yet, as we've seen with foreign misinformation and disinformation campaigns, a lie can spread around the world faster than the truth has a chance to tie its shoes. And Kenny Chu was a victim of that. And there were a number of other particularly conservative MPs, to the benefit of, in all these cases, Liberal MPs, coincidentally, that these conservative MPs lost their elections because of this because of this foreign interference. And if it had not been for leaks from our national security apparatus, if it had not been for the work of the Hogue Commission and the work of enterprising journalists like Sam Cooper, Canadians would never have known about this this serious threat to our country's national security. They would have never known the depths and the extent to which foreign powers, be they numerous, that are attempting to influence our country and attempting to intimidate politicians and intimidate diaspora communities in our country so that they don't participate in politics, or that they vote out of fear instead of out of their own self-interest. And to see that kind of allow that to happen, I saw a journalist tweet on X the other day that it seems so quaint. The Canada of 2015 seems so quaint now after 9 years of this Liberal government, where, you know, certainly we can't rule out that there was no foreign interference prior to 2015. However, the extent of the foreign interference that we've seen in the last 9 years proliferating under this Liberal government is shocking. I think if you took somebody who was here in 2015 and they could travel forward in time and they woke up in 2024, they'd be shocked at what has happened to their country, what has happened to our country, where multiple, not just like one country, but multiple countries with different complicated layers of intrigue are actively interfering in our democratic system, in our public debate, and yet we have a government that said it wasn't even happening just a few short years ago. We have here, previous to this motion coming forward, a motion to explore the very serious issues of foreign interference in relation to the alleged threats of India threatening Canadian citizens, particularly citizens of the Sikh community. And these are very serious allegations. And the fact that we're not studying that right now, I think, is problematic. And I understand that we're dealing with a motion here today related to clearances. And we have a Prime Minister who has access to this top secret information, who has chosen to weaponize it for his own partisan ends, who has, with this information, having this information, has failed to act for 9 years. In the case of one serious allegation involving a former Liberal member of Parliament, the Prime Minister, who had been fully briefed on the issues related to that member of Parliament, had stood up in the House and said that he looks forward to welcoming him back to caucus in the future. And for the Prime Minister, with the knowledge that he has, to make a claim like that is absolutely shocking. And it's only because of the fact that this information has not been transparent, or has not been shared, and has been basically keeping Canadians completely in the dark, that this has been allowed to continue, where the government has been able to get away with the selective release of national security information for the purpose of keeping Canadians in the dark about their members of Parliament. And the fact is that there's been lots of talk about the importance of getting these security clearances. However, it's also been noted quite effectively that even with these security clearances, there is basically nothing that any member of parliament can do to act on these. It's been said earlier that the names can't be revealed. So if a leader of a party were to get clearance and receive information that one of their members was compromised by a foreign state, they couldn't kick that member out of caucus, because if there was a risk, as has been said, that that member, the information about that member had been gathered clandestinely by a member of our intelligence or our allies' intelligence, that it could compromise them. And so it's very like, I don't know how, like, what people expect when the Prime Minister, who has had this information for years, has had this information as long as he's Prime Minister, failed to act in numerous cases within his own party. He has not removed a single member of his caucus from caucus. There was a member that left caucus voluntarily, but the Prime Minister has failed to act on these issues. So I don't know how they can expect any other leader in this Parliament to be able to act on this information, especially when this information was ostensibly supposed to be shared with the Chief of Staff of the Conservatives, and they're being told that it's on a need-to-know basis. Well, I think the Chief of Staff needs to know. I think certainly the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister knows this information. And I know the Chief of Staff of the Conservative Party to be a man of honor, a man of integrity, and I think that's entirely suitable. And what we will not accept is a situation where our leader, who has been fighting the fight on foreign interference publicly in the House of Commons, would in any way be restricted in his ability to hold this Liberal government to account. We have Conservatives who are members of the NSICOP committee. We have a Chief of Staff who has top secret security clearance. We have all the tools that the government says we should have at our disposal. And yet, what I see here from the NDP and the Liberals is just a blatant attempt to prevent the leader of the opposition from doing his constitutionally mandated job, which is to hold this government accountable for its failures. And I think one of those chief failures is going to be remembered as their lack of action on foreign interference and what has allowed us to get to this point today. So with that, I'd like to get back to the very important debate that we're having about India. I was really sad to see that we didn't receive unanimous consent in the House yesterday. I heard a Liberal member deny consent to the starting of a committee to deal with this very important issue. But with that, I would like to move with a motion to adjourn, and I'd like a recorded vote, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Clerk, if you would take your vote, please. Ms. Demoff, yes?
Adjourn debate on the motion is what we're voting on?
That was a motion to adjourn the meeting. So.
To adjourn the meeting, okay.
No, adjourn the debate on the motion.
Which would then call a vote on the motion?
Yeah, so the motion is to adjourn the debate on the sub-amendment.
Okay.
It's technically, I think the whole motion gets adjourned if
no,
there's a motion.
we're on the sub-amendment.
So we're on the sub-amendment. So we're going to take this as a motion to adjourn the sub-amendment.
However, point of order, Mr. Chair?
On a point of order, yes.
I would maybe possibly ask the clerk to clarify, if you make a vote to adjourn debate, is that only debate on the sub-amendment, or is that debate on the entire motion itself?
So we are engaging in debate on the sub-amendment. So if we're adjourning debate, to me, would be on the sub-amendment, but I'll check with the clerk.
Thank you.
So what are we going to watch next? Let's figure that out.
I'm informed it would be a debate, vote on the whole motion. No. So we have a motion to adjourn the debate on the motion as amended as sub-amendment. So, Mr. Clerk, if
Come on. Sorry, gang. I just ate. I'm not at my best. Ooh. But we have so many parliament, committee meetings to watch. So it's just not gonna work with me. Come.
and of course to introduce contraband, participate in.
How does CSC deal with anything
Going
negative?
blind, guys.
In my experience, they don't, or by quickly clamping down on those who are drawing attention to any negativity.
So in those situations, if we as Parliament are trying to evaluate how well our correctional system is operating, I mean, this is just a comment, it seems like we don't get the unvarnished truth. Now, I'm not going to ask you to comment on this specific scenario, but I did some work, and I believe I produced a video on it, wherein the Correctional Service of Canada put out a press release after somebody escaped. And the escape said the person escaped from institutional property. The person was on medium security. For those who don't know, that's 2 very large fences surrounding the institution, the same as maximum, in fact. Very difficult to escape from. And the service put out a bulletin saying he escaped from the grounds of medium security. Sounds fine, right? But the information I had was that this person was actually allowed to be outside the fence. That was a pretty material omission, in my view. If you're going to say someone escaped from medium security, I picture them jumping over 2 razor wire fences that are about 20 feet apart and are about 12 feet high. That's a pretty material omission, kind of like we sometimes see in Parliament, tell half the truth, and that's true. He was on the grounds. Can you comment not specifically on this case, but whether this type of thing is a surprise given your experience?
In my experience, that is absolutely no surprise. Those are more common than I think most people would ever believe.
And would, in that case, this service be trying to, I'm just inferring, that doesn't want to say this person was actually outside of the fence? You don't have to answer that. I'm just saying. It just seems they don't want to acknowledge this person was outside of the perimeter fence and they simply walked away. And yet we as parliamentarians and the public get the half-truth. I also exposed Paul Bernardo and his situation. And I said to the public, and I said very clearly, I came eye to eye with that offender. And CSC came out and were quoted that I had no interactions with that inmate. And yet I hadn't said I had any interactions, but they framed it as though I was lying about it. Does that type of reaction from CSC surprise you, given your experience?
Based on my experience, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Now, needle exchange. Jail has an underground economy, is that correct?
Yes.
Value, right? Drugs, weapons, any information, cell phones, everything has value, is that right?
That's correct. It's we phrase it, that's what makes jail go round, is that underground economy.
Monsieur le Président.
I have just... Oh.
Point d'ordre.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Pardon, Monsieur le Président, j'ai un peu...
Apologies. I don't see the link to disinformation for parliamentarians here. This seems to be completely off topic. Thank you for your comment, Mr. Villemur. The study is on disinformation and misinformation and the impact on parliamentarians. I believe that Mr. Caputo will bring his questions back to our study.
Go ahead, please.
Candidly, that we're talking about how a government agency communicates with the public and parliamentarians. I don't know what could be more germane to misinformation and disinformation. So I will move forward. The government has spoken with parliamentarians and the public about needle exchanges. What kind of picture have they painted about needle exchanges? And I've got about 10, 20, if you can answer that in about 15 seconds, please.
That it's a harm reduction measure.
What kind of danger are you seeing, and is that being communicated to parliamentarians?
I don't believe that's being accurately communicated at all. The dangers we're seeing is the introduction of weapons into the facilities and the feeding of this underground economy, where we're creating elements to the economy that we haven't dealt with before.
Your retribution.
Mr. Caputo, we're out of time on this round. Ms. Khalid, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Professor Wagner, if it's okay, I'll start with you. Perhaps I'm sure you've been studying this for the past couple of years now, and it's been a while where the Conservative Party leader has been attacking mainstream media and journalists with the intention to mislead and make Canadians believe that the news networks they have trusted before for many, many years are no longer trustworthy. Can you perhaps comment on the dangers that this presents to the state of Canada's information ecosystem and to our democracy?
Sure. There's a long line of research in the study of political communication that what researchers call blaming the referees is a strategy often that political elites can use to try to diminish trust in verifiably accurate news sources. And so there's a distinction to be made between news sources that have things like corrections policies and punish journalists when they get facts wrong versus other organizations that also sometimes frame themselves as being news organizations but are primarily opinion organizations. And so when it comes to the more trusted places, the places where they're engaging in what we would think of as more legitimate journalism, which doesn't mean they're always right, but means that they correct themselves when they are wrong. It's a danger to diminish trust in those organizations without evidence. And a lot of times a strategy that political elites use is to try and diminish the amount of trust in mainstream news sources. And the purpose of that diminishing trust is then to not face consequences from voters at the ballot box, as an example, for behaviors lawmakers or others may engage in.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I will tack on the second half of that question to my next question. Now, inflammatory language and material, you spoke about this in your opening remarks as well with respect to emotions getting more engagement than facts. And we've seen dog whistles, etc., by political parties generating a lot of engagement. And that engagement does lead to ad revenue as well. So is it fair to say that media platforms are actually benefiting financially when and if they allow this dissemination of mis and disinformation on their platforms?
I think it's fair to say that social media platforms benefit from that and that some news media platforms benefit from that as well. It partially depends upon the major purpose of the platform and why people use it. And so if it's a place where people are trying to learn what's true, there might not be as much of a financial benefit as for those who might seek out a news source because that source tells them that they are right and the other side is wrong. And so there are advantages to following that kind of model, but not for all media in a blanket way.
I appreciate that. And I'll go back to my original question partly. Say, is there any correlation between a person's distrust of mainstream media sources and their participation in the democratic process? And if so, how?
There is in some ways. And so people who distrust mainstream sources tend to be more supportive of political violence as an avenue to exact political preferences. Many people who are distrustful of mainstream news sources are also highly participatory. And in fact, many people who believe in conspiracy theories are extraordinarily knowledgeable and have very low trust in political institutions like mainstream news media sources or elements of government. And so there are lots of different ways that one's distrust of news could foster participation, sometimes encouraging more violence, but often encouraging more participation in voting, political donations, posting online, things like that.
I appreciate that. Now, I understand, you spoke about this, about the role that the Western social media platforms play. Do you think that there is an obligation on these social media platforms with respect to the algorithms and how information is disseminated, whether it is truthful information or it's misinformation, disinformation, hate speech? Do you think that social media companies have a responsibility to control how those algorithms are impacting what an individual Canadian is seeing within their feed and how it's impacting their participation in the democratic process?
I think that there are responsibilities that social media platforms have when it comes to the unfettered amplification of things that are known to be false. Those can often be very dangerous and have violent consequences or other consequences that might be political consequences but are related to believing in things that are verifiably not true. Much of politics operates in a gray area where some things that are said are true and some things are not, and so it can be dangerous for social media platforms to regulate with too heavy of a hand and stifle speech. But when it comes to de-amplifying statements that are known to be verifiably false, social media platforms have an obligation to, in my view, to not try to share that information widely with their users.
Now, you spoke a little bit about fact-checking as a method of controlling misinformation, disinformation, and how it's disseminated. And you also talked about the bias as to who exactly is fact-checking. Now, I've seen, a lot of people, some people, if they're sold on an idea, you Google something, you'll find 20 articles countering your idea. All you need to do is to find that one article to confirm what your belief
Ms. Khalid,
is.
if you can just quick...
Absolutely. How do you think that plays into what kind of regulations and partnerships governments need to have with social media companies in that dissemination of information?
I need a very quick response, please.
That's a very difficult question to answer because it's very difficult to figure out the volume there. And so it's something that platforms need to discuss with regulators, but I don't have a quick answer to that question, I'm sorry to say.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering that if the witness can perhaps think about it and give a written response to that question.
I'll deal with that at the end of the meeting like we typically do with those requests.
We're going to move on to Monsieur Villemur for 6 minutes. For the witnesses.
The French translation, please, Monsieur Villemur. Commencez pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us. It was a pleasure to hear from you, and it was very interesting. I'll start with Mr. Wagner. Social media, in general, are they cautious of disinformation, or do they simply say that they are? As my colleague mentioned earlier, there's revenue associated with clicks. So is it a surface level awareness?
At first, I think that they is a term, like social media platforms operate really differently. But in general, social media platforms vary in how aggressive they are at de-amplifying false claims, amplifying other kinds of claims. As an example, in the United States, in 2016, a high percentage of things that were not true were exposed to people over Facebook. Facebook was then deeply criticized for that, and in 2020, that percentage dropped precipitously because Facebook engaged in more aggressive diminishment of inauthentic behavior on their platform. Mm-hmm. And when the criticism died down, they stopped doing that, and that percentage is increasing again. And so they're not static in how they engage in these kinds of behaviors. And it often is in response to criticism and perceptions of potential regulation.
Ben, ça vous mentionné un peu plus tôt.
You mentioned earlier that frivolous things might generate more clicks than something more serious. Considering that social media is used less for information and more for enjoying oneself, how can somebody share a serious message when people are mostly using social media for entertainment?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with the audience individual social media users cultivate. And so some people, most people, I think, cultivate audiences around their interests related to entertainment in some sort of way, or sports, or those kinds of things. But others cultivate audiences based upon commenting on public affairs, sharing evidence about politics, or trying to organize and persuade people, or to sow chaos into the social media ecosphere. And so I think it really depends upon what the purpose is to answer that question.
Vous savez que Twitter a un problème au Brésil.
Twitter recently had a problem in Brazil. They were banned and are now back. Did Twitter change anything so that they could operate in Brazil?
I'm not directly aware of changes that Twitter made with respect to what happened to them in Brazil. I can say that in general, they often alter their behaviors in response to governments regulating or fining them.
Donc, comme vous l'affirmiez un peu plus tôt,
As you stated earlier, you shed a light on an issue, they'll work on it while the light is still shining, and then they'll go back to their previous behavior, correct?
That at least happened with Facebook, and we know to some degree that that's happened after the ownership change of Twitter and then the renaming of Twitter to X. There's been a difference in the content moderation behaviors of that platform since then.
Pourriez-vous élaborer sur la modération du contenu de X?
Can you talk about the different content moderation of X?
There is far less content moderation. Most of the staff that were doing that were either fired or quit after Twitter was taken over by Mr. Musk. And so part of it is that, but there also still, it's not that there isn't any, there's a feature, I think now it's called Community Notes, that will sometimes append a post. But usually the thing that has to happen to get to that feature being enacted is that multiple sides of a political debate have to agree that the claim is false. And so if one side is pushing a false claim, that's not usually enough to invoke the Community Notes feature.
Est-ce que, en matière de désinformation,
Regarding disinformation, if you had to single out the worst platform, which one would it be?
That's a really hard question. I think probably Truth Social would be, I think, the single worst. There's kind of unfettered access to saying things that aren't true, and very little behavior from the platform that lets the audience know that claims being shared widely are not true.
Si je vais exclure pour le moment Truth Social de la...
Let's take Truth Social out of the equation, because that's certain users and not most of the population. Could you identify a platform other than Truth Social?
Qui pourrait-on...
Who could we identify other than Truth Social as being kind of the worst for disinformation?
It's hard to say with accuracy because we don't know the denominator of how many posts are made on all of the different platforms as compared to how many things aren't true. My impression is that X has now become that leader, but I don't know that as an empirical fact.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Wagner.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Thank you, Mr. Villemur.
6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wagner, can you please state your subject matter expertise on this one more time for the record?
Sure. I have a PhD in political science, and I conduct research on individual engagement in information ecologies, and including news, social media, and individual conversation, and look at outcomes related to what people believe to be true, what they want from their government, and how they participate civically and politically.
Mr. Suzali, can you please state your subject matter expertise on misinformation and disinformation?
I'll state my experience as a correctional officer since 2007 within the federal penitentiary system.
So no subject matter expertise on misinformation. Okay. Mr. Wagner, with that being said, who are the primary actors spreading misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation? And I know you're coming from an American context, but perhaps you might have some insight into the Canadian political system.
A lot of mis and disinformation that is shared in Western democracies originates from Russian sources in the IRA, Internet Research Agency, and other bot farms in different parts of Europe that exist to kind of sow false claims and try and spread them. In the American context, a key spreader of misinformation that also gets a lot of attention is the former president, Donald Trump, as in terms of an account that spreads a lot of misinformation. But I would say, the primary organization that is really attempting to influence elections in Canada, in the United States, is the Russian IRA.
And are certain parliamentarians more at risk than others in being targeted and affected by disinformation campaigns?
It seems to be that the IRA or the Russian government has candidates they would prefer to see win elections and candidates they would prefer to see lose elections, and so those they would prefer to see lose tend to be more in the to have a greater likelihood of being targeted with negative information. Although sometimes candidates in different parties get positive and negative information from these agencies as an effort to just sow chaos and be confusing, which is often one of the objectives of this kind of organization.
Is it fair to say that this goes well beyond Russia? Because, I would put to you that it's been my experience, we love to oversimplify this as Russian, Chinese, maybe Indian sometimes. But is it not fair to say that there are various state-sponsored internet propaganda machines that are used to spread this? And, I would reference Operation Earnest Voice, and, in the United States of America. I would reference, you talked about Donald Trump. Obviously, the United States was a prime propagator of the Chinese virus during COVID and a lot of vaccine misinformation, disinformation. There are allies such as so-called allies such as Israel with the Hasbara. They have a whole ministry of strategic affairs that deals with targeting political actors, and I know that that's kind of come out in the United States. So can you maybe just take a step back and zoom back and talk a little bit more beyond Russia in terms of the state-sponsored internet propaganda machines that are out there?
There are lots of state-sponsored efforts to try and influence elections in other countries and in their own countries. There are lots of non-state sponsored organizations that also are trying to do the same and do so by trying to spread mis and disinformation. So yeah, it's certainly not any one actor. If asked to name the primary one, I would say Russia, as I was asked earlier. But in general, there are as many opportunities as there are users of the internet in some respects.
What advice would you have, if any, on us dealing with attempts or times or scenarios that become prevalent when our so-called allies are actively engaged in presenting misinformation and disinformation? Do you view it as a national security threat when foreign state actors are actively engaged in spreading disinformation and misinformation?
That's outside my area of expertise, but I, as a citizen, worry about how state-sponsored mis and disinformation from or toward allies or adversaries. I think I worry about all of it, and so it's certainly something that, in my view, governments should be talking with each other about, and also parliamentarians should be talking with their constituents about.
In terms of a risk assessment in national security, how high would you put misinformation and disinformation as being a threat to free and fair elections when it comes to Western democracies?
Much higher than it used to be, at least in the United States context. Mis and disinformation on social media platforms has been tied to encouraging the January 6th atrocities at the United States Capitol as an example of how mis and disinformation about the results of an election can foment political violence. There's also a high number of mis and disinformation behaviors that occur around elections, trying to target particular populations, telling them the wrong day for an election, or telling them rules about what they have to do when they vote that aren't accurate, and those sorts of things. And so those are all dangers to free and fair elections.
Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You're out of time, Mr. Green. Okay,
We'll
sorry.
get you on the next round.
So that concludes our first round. We are going to have 2 5-minute rounds and a 2.5-minute round, and that'll conclude our first panel. We want to try to keep it on time here. I'm going to go back to Mr. Caputo for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Susley, before I begin, this idea of expertise is an interesting one because sometimes we have, and people can chuckle, but sometimes we have a, okay, I apologize. I thought that it was a tuckle to my question. People can have different views on expertise, but in my view, 17 years of real-world expertise or real-world knowledge is highly beneficial to this committee. So I thank you for being here. Sir, do you fear any repercussions for what you are saying to this committee here?
I do.
Do you feel fear, I should say?
Yeah, I anticipate some kind of punitive response to this.
Would you be prepared to let this committee know if there is any sort of response or fallout from your testimony here today, given that you were invited by parliamentarians and are simply answering questions from parliamentarians truthfully?
I have no concern with doing that.
I'm going to ask you about gangs in jail and how it's communicated to the public and parliamentarians by the CSC and what's really happening. Do you have any comment on gangs in jail and how that's being communicated and what's really going on?
The CSC prides themselves in having successfully eliminated gangs out of Canadian prisons a number of years ago. I believe it was 2014, 2015. That is a celebrated accomplishment amongst the brass of the CSC, which was accomplished by changing the name of gangs to security threat groups.
Like, what does that mean? Security threat groups? Was it simply just a change in the name, and therefore we say no gangs exist? Do I have that right?
Yes, it was a name change that out of one side of the mouth eliminated gangs, and on the other hand created a very new problem with a very newly named group.
Somebody was to testify before Parliament and say, gangs are not an issue, but we didn't know this, and we have to say security threat groups are. That's certainly misleading in my view. I want you to talk as well about, we are told that in corrections there's safe, secure, humane control, and people are transferred in consistent, when I say transferred down security from maximum to medium to minimum, in accordance with their risk to public safety and things like that. Do you have any comment on that, sir?
That's a very hot issue amongst correctional officers about what we perceive and believe is the inaccurate security classification of inmates being inappropriately downgraded or downgraded through security levels without the outside of where that inmate is fit to be operating in. When we have a maximum security inmate positioned into a medium or minimum security environment, of course that produces all kinds of threats to us and to the public.
And is the public, is this type of thing routinely communicated to parliamentarians and the public?
It's very rarely communicated to anyone internally. I would be shocked if it was communicated externally at all. It's usually done through the form of what's called overrides.
Overrides, okay. What's an override is when a manager essentially says, I disagree with what the computer has spit out and I'm going to change that on my own. That's a kind of crude way of putting it. Is that accurate?
Essentially.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair, please?
A minute and 10 seconds.
Okay, in a minute and 10 seconds, when somebody's incarcerated, there's a perception that this person is especially in medium and maximum, but people perceive minimum, which has no fences, that people are behind fences. Are there times where people have work clearances or unofficially are escorted out of jails in your experience, contrary to policy, and is that ever communicated?
Absolutely, that happens on an extremely, I would suggest, daily basis in most institutions across the country.
You describe, without breaching any confidentiality or anything like that, describe a scenario that is common knowledge to somebody in your industry?
We have inmates serving life sentences who are not eligible for any forms of parole, but are given fence clearance to work off-site and not out of perimeter during the business day.
Communicated to the public or parliamentarians in annual reports or anything like that?
No, not communicated anywhere.
I assume that's my time, Mr. Chair.
It's close to it. Thank you, Mr. Caputo. Ms. Shanahan for 5. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. Professor Wagner, I find it very interesting, the remarks that you've made, and the fact that you have been you have been undertaking research in this area, which, we must admit is fairly new. So I know that you have you've co-written and published a paper in July 2024 entitled Slant, Extremity, and Diversity, How the Shape of News Use Explains Electoral Judgments and Confidence. And it introduces measures that captures individuals' partisan slant, partisan extremity, and overall diversity of news media used to understand how people interact with contemporary news ecology. Now, one of the conclusions, and I don't pretend to have read this paper, but our analysts have, and I thank them for this question. One of the conclusions in this paper is that a diverse news consumption style can moderate misinformation beliefs. Now, what do you mean by that? What is a diverse news consumption style?
So thank you for the question. A diverse news consumption style is using a wide range of sources, oftentimes some of which will include sources that tend to favor a political ideology other than that of the individual of interest. And so that would be, a liberal who also gets some news from conservative outlets. A conservative will also get some news from liberal outlets, but also, engages in a higher number of sources to learn from rather than a smaller number. So both the volume and or diversity, and then the slant, the direction of the information from a political perspective.
Okay, so when you mean diversity, it's actually in points of view, because I was wondering if it actually had to do with types of media, just knowing that watching television news, for example, very different experience from looking at Facebook news. Would that's a diversity that's important?
So in that particular paper, we don't use social media because that social media aren't news sources. They don't produce news in the way that a journalist does. They share news, and a lot of what gets shared on social media are links to news. But in that particular paper, it's looking at news sources, print, broadcast, digital, radio, those kinds of sources. And there's some evidence that different sources have different, like broadcast news, broadcast television tends to help those with less education learn more about politics, whereas newspapers tend to help, and digital news tends to help folks with more education learn about politics. So there are some differences in how people benefit from the different sources they might consume.
Professor, help me out here because so when we think about different news sources and that they would have different points of view, I consider myself a well-read person. I consume a lot of news, and I would think that CNN is considered liberal. Washington Post, I don't know. CTV, I would have considered conservative, but now apparently it's liberal. Like, how do we identify, or is that even useful to be identifying different news sources that way?
It's a real challenge, and any way that anyone, including myself, makes those labels is open to criticism. So one strategy is to use what we did in that paper, which is a set of scores called the Ferris scores that array news sources based upon the ideological orientation of their users. And so that is one way to measure how liberal or conservative or centrist a source might be. Another would be to compare the kinds of sources that news organizations quote with the kind of sources that lawmakers of different political parties quote, and look for correspondence between those. And so if a newspaper quoted sources that more liberal parliamentarians refer to in speeches, that might be an example of that paper being more liberal, and another, and vice versa. But all of these, of course, have their problems. None of them are infallible.
Recommendation before my time is over on what you would consider the most well-balanced news sources or credible news sources?
I would say often sources that are public sponsored. So the United States, like National Public Radio and public television, as an example, the BBC as another. These are often high quality news sources. It's also the case, though, that any government sponsored source does run the danger of bias that might favor the government since they are signing the checks.
Okay. At your next study.
Thank you, Ms. Shanahan. Monsieur Villemure, pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
For 2.5 minutes, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wagner, I'll come back to you. We've gotten used to living with things that are false or untrue. And there are people who create news. Is it too late to counter disinformation?
I don't think it's too late. I think there are, among the fastest growing legitimate news sources in the West are fact-checking news organizations. So there is an audience for reporting that does more than just say, here's what our leaders said, but says, were these things verifiably accurate, and how do we know that or not? And so I don't think it's too late, but it's definitely an uphill battle.
To your knowledge, do you believe that Canadian legislation is strong enough to counter disinformation?
I am sadly not enough of an area expert to speak to that. I wish I could, but that's not my area of expertise.
Alors, est-ce que vous auriez une... Would you have a recommendation on what it would be important to act on as quickly as possible?
I think information that's time dependent. And so, when there is a natural disaster and there's dis or misinformation about government response to it, when there is an election where the time to vote ends at a certain time and there's mis or disinformation floating around, I think things with a time deadline, I think, are probably the most important to engage in action about.
De votre point de vue de scientifique.
As a political scientist, is it strange that we hear talk about lies every day and that we simply accept that people brazenly lie with no consequences? Does that have an impact on democracy?
I think that it does. Most folks don't know very much about what's going on in their country and around the world. And most people don't wake up and ask themselves, how do they hold their government accountable today? What instead, they rely upon legitimate sources of information to create penalties for lying. Penalties such as not being reelected, censure or sanction from their colleagues, a public embarrassment for things that they say that are not true. And we see a decrease in many Western countries with respect to those kinds of behaviors, both from lawmakers and from news organizations in some respects over time. And we see as societies polarize and divide, we see an increasing willingness of people to forgive the sins of their side and focus on the sins of the other side.
Okay. Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur Villemure. Mr. Green, 2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to be able to explore some of those concepts, perhaps in English, for the good and welfare of the people that are watching, because we have had several witnesses appear before this committee in the context of the study to talk about misinformation and disinformation and how it can negatively impact Canadians' trust in public institutions. So the current information ecosystem has been seeing an erosion in trust that some people have as well in traditional media. And obviously the same impacts are happening in the States. So have you done research on the impact of misinformation and disinformation on public trust in institutions and traditional media?
Yes, but not in Canada.
What are the main takeaways from the American example that we might be able to learn from?
One is that when ideological sources attack the referees, which is to say attack legitimate news sources time and time again, and then want to rely upon those sources to fact check things that they care about, they learn quickly that their audience no longer trusts them. And so we've seen very prominent people who've engaged in kind of polarized communication on talk radio and cable television in the United States sow distrust in legitimate news sources. And then when a candidate came along of their own party that they didn't like, and they told their audience, we can't trust this person because they lie all the time, their audience said, but you told us not to trust these sources. And so when there are no referees, it's very difficult to maintain the integrity of a game or integrity of politics.
In terms of ideological ecosystems, we know that in that continuum, it ends in a place of ideologically motivated violent extremism. We know that in the States, or at least it's been reported, and I'll leave it to you to comment as a subject matter expert, that the 2 attempts on Donald Trump's life were in fact from ideologically motivated right-wing extremists. Is that not correct?
I'm confident that at least one of those is correct, and I believe that the most recent reporting I've seen is consistent with your characterization.
And so in that space, you quite rightly identify that when this ecosystem of violence, political violence, is unleashed in a world that is absent of fact and completely disassociated from basic civil norms, political violence will impact everybody. Is that a safe assumption to make?
It certainly could, and it's the case that individuals feel it. In survey research that we do, when we ask those who don't participate in politics why they don't, a non-trivial percentage say it's because there are too many dangerous people out there who, are often believing some of the things that you're talking about with respect to things that aren't true that can often lead to political violence.
Okay. So in short, that undermines democracy at its foundation if people don't even want to engage because they're afraid of ideologically violent people.
You can't have a free and fair election if everyone doesn't feel safe to participate.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Mr. Wagner. I want to thank you and Mr. Suzla for being here today. That concludes our first panel. And going back to what Ms. Khalid had said earlier, I invite both of you to submit to the committee in writing any other thoughts that you may have, because oftentimes you'll walk away and you'll think, I should have said that, should have. So I invite you to do that through the clerk who contacted you to be part of this meeting today. And I would ask if you're going to do that, Friday by 5 o'clock would be a good time to set as a deadline, okay? So I'm going to suspend for a couple minutes before we move to our next panel. The meeting is suspended.
Companies, the movement of use these technologies to reach across their border.
Samantha Bradshaw, who's an assistant professor, new technology and security. She's here by video conference, and from the Toronto Metropolitan University, Kareem Bardizi, who is the executive director, as well as Mr. McAndrews, who is here today. I want to welcome you all to the committee.
Mr. McAndrews is not
Oh, sorry, Mr. McAndrews is not here. My apologies. I see that on the screen. So, Kareem, welcome, and Samantha, welcome. Ms. Bradshaw, you have up to 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead, please.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Samantha Bradshaw. I'm an assistant professor in new technology and security at American University, where I also direct the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology. And for the past 8 years, my research has examined questions around how state actors co-opt and weaponize social media for achieving political goals. Some of this research has focused on Russian interference, and so I'll spend most of my time discussing doing this work here today. There's really no doubt that emerging and digital technologies have expanded the scope, the scale, the reach, the precision of disinformation campaigns, and state actors like Russia have learned to use these technologies to reach across their borders and influence individuals in ways that can undermine democracy and the expression of human rights. Since 2017, platforms have been taking down multiple campaigns. In the hundreds now, we've seen state-backed disinformation campaigns being removed by Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and these activities have also been documented across other kinds of platforms, chat applications like WhatsApp, or alternative platforms like Parler. Disinformation and propaganda on these platforms, of course, are used to influence online audiences in ways that advance Russia's geopolitical ambitions. Sometimes they rely on more covert tactics, such as the use of fake social media accounts, bots, online troll farms to spread false information or other harmful narratives discreetly. And other times they rely on more overt propaganda strategies that come from state-sponsored media outlets like RT and Sputnik, which openly disseminate pro-Kremlin narratives. Many of the strategies, too, that we see today really reflect this longer history of Cold War strategies where Soviet leadership undertook many efforts to alter audience attitudes, opinions, and perspectives on events and issues around the world. Back in the day, in addition to promoting overt and attributable content on social media, Soviet entities also employed news agencies, sympathetic newspapers abroad, and courted journalists as sources to spread unattributable messages. And today we're seeing a lot of these strategies also play out in the development of fake websites and fake journalist personas, the development of front media organizations, and the co-option of social media influencers. Some of my more recent work looking at Russian state-backed media coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests in the U.S. over the summer of 2020 investigated elements of this Russian-affiliated media landscape and its digital presence. And we found that a lot of the front media organizations often developed and tailored content to different segments of English-speaking users. A lot of this content was really about playing both sides and emphasizing the racial divides in American politics, with some outlets expressing support for the Black Lives Matter protesters and others emphasizing support for the police and the Blue Lives Matter movement. By tracking a lot of the ownership of the media companies, the movement of staff and journalists that were affiliated with known Russian news agencies, we found lots of connections in the incorporation, the funding, and the personnel who are working for media outlets that claim to be independent from the Russian government. And while things like editorial independence can, of course, be subjective, funding and ownership relations are key criteria in any evaluation process. A lot of the strategies around state media, influencers, front organizations, they've appeared in information operations in other countries around the globe. This includes, as far away as Africa and across the Sahel states, where I've also worked on platform data investigating Russian activities here. And in these examples, we see the co-option of local influencers who are often paid by Russian actors to generate this veneer of legitimacy around the content that is being produced and amplified on social media. So while the specific goals of any influence operation will vary, many are really designed with this intent to disrupt the social fabric of society. In the context of the Sahel, Russian disinformation campaigns often highlighted anti-Western, anti-colonial narratives that really fed into this localized and generational memory to amplify divides within and across society. And this really brings me to my final point that I want to make in my opening remarks about contemporary Russian information operations, and that's that many don't really rely on what we consider traditionally to be disinformation. A lot of the more effective campaigns that we see don't rely on this sense of false information, things that can be easily fact-checked, but rely on identity-based disinformation and tropes around racism, sexism, xenophobia, or, you know, even who we are as political citizens. And these tropes are really used then to polarize, to suppress, and to undermine our institutions of democracy.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Bradshaw. The toughest part of my job is having to cut somebody off when they're on a roll, and you were on a roll. So,
honestly, it was right at the end.
Okay, so. Wonderful. It was an abrupt ending. Mr. Bardizzi, you're up for 5 minutes, sir. Go ahead, address the committee.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and for doing this important work. I'm Kareem Bardizzi. I'm the Executive Director of the DAIS, a policy and leadership think tank at Toronto Metropolitan University, working on the bold ideas and better leaders Canada needs for more shared prosperity and shared citizenship. We work in areas of economic, education, and democracy policy. I'll be drawing on my remarks from two studies we've done recently, one supported by the Privy Council Office's Democratic Institutions Secretariat as part of our annual Democracy Exchange Summit, and another one supported by the Department of Canadian Heritage's Digital Citizen Initiative, the Survey of Online Harms. 3 points. First, the state of the threat of foreign or external misinformation and disinformation, it's real, it's ever-changing, and it points, as Professor Bradshaw said, at specific communities triggering specific identities. Canada's National Cyber Threat Assessment has described online foreign influence activities as a new normal. And some of this is difficult to detect. For instance, disinfo and misinfo and private messaging platforms are more likely to reach specific cultural communities or specific identity groups, and they're harder by their very nature to study. And the design of these platforms also makes it more difficult to for the users who are concerned that there may be misinfo or disinfo on those platforms to be flagged for content concern. There's also a number of new vectors, and some have only come to the public attention through judicial actions in other countries. Professor Bradshaw mentioned Russian disinfo, and so you're probably aware that the U.S. Justice Department recently charged 2 employees of RT, a Russian state-controlled media outlet, not for their own content, but in a $10 million US dollar scheme to create and distribute content with hidden Russian government messaging. Some of these payments, as you're probably aware, went to prominent Canadian YouTubers. But the extent of this deception was only revealed thanks to the discovery that accompanies criminal proceedings. Prominent online actors can also play an important role in spreading foreign misinfo and disinfo. A recent study by Reset Tech shows that Elon Musk's personal engagement with content can amplify 250 or more fold the audience that a piece of foreign misinfo or disinfo receives out in the real world. Another new vector are deepfakes, again, with some of the old techniques, but now fueled by powerful AI algorithms that are available to many at low or no cost. Our recent study of online harm showed that 60% of Canadian residents say they have seen a deepfake online, with 23% reporting seeing deepfakes more than a couple times a week. And that kind of exposure to deepfakes is correlated with the use of social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, X, TikTok, as well as ChatGPT. Second, how to respond to this threat. So it's real and it's coming in multiple forms, and those forms are constantly evolving. On this, our report has a number of recommendations for policymakers, civil society, and individual citizens, and I'll be sure to be tabling that report with you. Recommendations for policymakers and institutions, policy recommendations for civil society, and recommendations for individual citizens. Although I will caution this group, your committee, around expecting too much on behalf of citizens to equip them. They need to indeed be equipped with media and digital literacy skills, but the power of these platforms and their ubiquity really require a policy response. At the DAIS, we joined dozens of other civil society and research organizations to urge timely passage of Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act. Although misinfo and disinfo isn't an explicitly prescribed harm under the Act, misinfo and disinfo helps fuel the harms that are identified in the Act. And so we would urge timely passage of that. Third, I'd like to address misinfo and disinfo, not foreign influence, but as it relates to the Canadian media ecosystem generally. How Canadians consume media makes them more vulnerable to some of the, those consumption trends make them more vulnerable to some of the phenomena that you are studying. We know that more Canadians are getting their news online, specifically from social media, and that less are participating in a shared space and consuming information produced by organizations that have strong or identifiable journalistic standards, or standards of review, evidence, and context to begin with. And we also know that the effects of recent corporate decisions and policies can make the media ecosystem weaker. So for instance, Meta and Facebook, which is a source of news according to the Reuters digital study, 25% of Canadians get news from Facebook, 29% get it from YouTube. Well, the recent decision to throttle by Meta news on Facebook and Instagram means that in our study, 41% of respondents say that it has had a negative effect on their ability to stay current with the news. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Well, thank you both for your opening statements. We're going to do 2 rounds, 6 minutes to start with Mr. Caputo. Go ahead, Mr. Caputo, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bardizzi. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Great, thank you. And Professor Bradshaw, I appreciate you both being here. Now, Professor Bradshaw, you're currently, it sounds like a tenure-track professor in the U.S., is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, and this isn't bad or good or anything, I'm just wondering, have you lived in Canada or just stayed here during an election campaign or anything like that?
I have. Even though I live and work in the U.S., I'm actually Canadian, so.
Okay, perfect. Well, then that's good. So, so you'll be up to date, I'm sure, on a lot of Canadian political happenings. If you could name each of you, you all have your area of expertise, and sometimes we get very nuanced area of expertise, but I always like to ask this question. If you could change one thing that would inhibit misinformation, disinformation, you've talked a lot about social media, if you were responsible in this area for the Canadian government, what would you do first thing tomorrow? First, Professor Bradshaw.
Sure. I think I would be working around issues that have more to do with platform transparency. And I say this because I think, even especially with the Canadian context, we actually don't have a very good empirical understanding of how the activities that we see state actors engage in translate to changes in behavior, and particularly voting behavior. I think there are some real measurable consequences of these kinds of campaigns when they, for example, attack activists or female journalists, because there's clear kind of political suppression happening with very measurable consequences that appear in the literature. But getting somebody to change their mind or to alter their voting behavior, these kinds of things are very ingrained and embedded in our identities, and being able to actually get access to better data to study social media's immediate effect on those kinds of attitudinal changes over time, I think is really, really important to enhance a lot of the concerns raised by the field. We're starting to develop more empirics and evidence around this, but we need better access to data. And so that's where I would really start if I wanted to see changes. I unfortunately don't think that there is a silver bullet solution to mis and disinformation. There isn't something that we can immediately do to make this problem kind of go away, because it's kind of something that's really at the conflux of human behavior and the real technical design of platforms that might incentivize certain kinds of information to go viral over others, which again is also socially shaped by the people who are interacting with it. And so it's something that will need a lot more long-term attention to. So I think starting with the empirics and getting a better grounding and understanding of the causal mechanisms will be really, really important.
Sounds like we're looking at a 10 to 20 year project here based on the way you said it. And Mr. Bardizzi, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I definitely endorse every single thing that Professor Bradshaw said, and to create that fact base for policymakers is really important. I will maybe answer with two quick points. One, a longer term project, but to have an olive system, education system response that brings in the media companies and those who are collectively responsible for creating a shared space for debate and factual presentation. And that, I believe, is a shared actually responsibility between educators and the media sector. And the second, I'll come back to, I think the passage of the Online Harms Act, Bill C-63, would have a positive effect on some of these phenomena.
You know, one thing that I'm struck by as a parliamentarian, and I came in partway through this study, but you talk about deepfakes and I have my idea of what that is. One of the things that really gives me concern is just how easy it is to create such content, and secondarily, how easy it is to disseminate such content. Given those two factors, are we really in a situation where, rather than, as opposed to prevention, we're really looking at management?
I think yes, but I also think that in the context of, mis and disinformation and coordinated efforts to manipulate election processes, there's a much longer kill chain for, the technical kind of platform speak around an information operation. In order to get the deep fake on the platform and going viral, you have to be able to create a fake account. And in order to create the fake account, you have to deceive a lot of the internal systems within these platforms. And so I think even though there is an easier ability to kind of create and disseminate deep fake related content, if we're talking about it in the context of an information operation, we still need to consider the broader life cycle that these operations have to go through. And a lot of the mitigation measures have nothing really to do with the AI side of things. It still relies much more on, the old school kind of IP detection and all of the tricks that platforms play to figure out if this is a real person or a fake account.
Thank you, Professor Bradshaw, Mr. Caputo. We're going to go to Mr. Baines for 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for joining us today. I'm going to start with Ms. Bradshaw. If you could maybe talk a little bit about, you mentioned tropes and other methods, tactics employed by Russia specifically, and we've recently seen a rise in other hostile actors to manipulate Western voices. And then there's the use of, say, even domestic commentators who amplify these tropes. Can you maybe describe that a little bit, how it's being translated here, and then having domestic commentators amplifying these things, and then how we can maybe combat some of those things?
Yeah, definitely. So in a lot of the more effective disinformation campaigns that I've studied, I think a lot of them aren't relying on false information, but instead they're drawing on harmful identity tropes. And they're using these ideas around racism, sexism, xenophobia to polarize society, to suppress certain kinds of people from participating, or even to incite violence against particular groups or individuals within societies. And I think when we're thinking about combating this kind of identity-based disinformation, it's really a tricky challenge, because when you can't just slap a label on something that is sexist on the internet, and you can't just simply fact check racism away. It's very much a long-term human bias problem. And so it's going to take a long-term kind of strategy to manage that. But I think drawing attention to the fact that these are kind of the tactics and strategies of influence operations today is really important. I think platforms can do more, like particularly on the political violence side of things, and when we're going to more extreme and egregious cases. I'm thinking about like Myanmar and the coordinated campaigns against the Rohingya population by the government there, where we see like violence and even a genocide against a particular group of people. Having platforms do appropriate human rights assessments, making sure that they have enough content moderators who have local language understanding and local contextual understanding of any given society.
So you're
really
putting
important.
it back onto the platform providers to do a little bit more work as well. But like I met with the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress yesterday. They advocated for bans on Russian state-led media on the internet. Canada has banned certain media. It's also taken measures to look at other social media platforms, WeChat, and TikTok and others like that. So I'm wondering if bans are effective, and if you can maybe talk a little bit about that and getting into maybe I'll actually switch to Mr. Bardisi and maybe engage in the conversation as well. Maybe you can maybe shed some light on that. And why are these methods working?
Well, banning on broadcast channels is a bit easier than banning internet sites or online content. That's why we think of the DAIS, the Online Harms Act, which doesn't look at so much specific platforms, but looks at this specific behavior and content, is the way to go. Coupled with some of that algorithmic transparency, coupled with some of that availability to have data that Professor Bradshaw mentioned. I'll also, I guess, bring a piece that we haven't really talked about yet, which this entire conversation exists in a context of trust or mistrust. And where there is a trusted messenger, that is where the misinfo or disinfo is more likely to land. And where there's a context of mistrust, then a messenger can fill that vacuum and generate trust. I think that's the main concern with some of these propaganda outfits. It's not that people around this table don't see them as propaganda. It's more that there are people who are perhaps have lower trust in some of the mainstream media institutions or some of the institutions of society more generally. In Canada, the Reuters Digital News Survey shows that trust in mainstream media and news overall has fallen 20 points over the last few years, 20 percentage points. So it's in that context that some of these actors can weaponize some of those platforms or associate themselves with ideas that are harmful to Canada. It's very difficult, both legislatively and in other ways, to actually ban platforms or sites in Canada. Countries have tried to do this, including some Western countries, and some in the global South with very large populations. And we've seen those bans. TikTok is banned in India. There was an attempt to ban X in Brazil. That itself is difficult enough to ban at the individual outlet level is very operationally difficult and may not be meeting the interests of what we're trying to pursue here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baines. En avant de commencer avec Monsieur Villemur.
Before we move on with Mr. Villemur, I want to make sure that both witnesses are hearing English with us today. And I'll start with looking at
these go or strategy against these kinds of
just means not but it's up to us tactic and so we need political debate ruling those agents, foreign agents that want to confidence of interest on this leadership. I'll respond.
And so those good debate.
Mr. Chair,
to support answer to that back to kind of and other they are in kind of a public record of very difficult cases to sort of set precedent for how these decisions are made, I think are really positive steps. And I'd want to see more transparency initiatives and more kind of efforts going into that kind of those kinds of applications.
Il faut voir aussi que l'intérêt public de l'un n'aligne pas toujours avec l'intérêt.
And one's interest does not necessarily align with somebody else's. Thank you, Monsieur Villemur.
You have 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome both subject matter experts. It's nice to have subject matter experts here today, but I do know that you bring with you your own unique political experiences. Mr. Bardesi, I do know you from your previous life, and I'm wondering, without putting you on the spot, if you're comfortable talking about your political experience in campaigns at all.
Sure. Yeah, I'm here as an expert witness, but I do have that background, both as a political staffer and more recently as a candidate in the provincial election 2022. And I'll say that I observed the in a very acute way, and perhaps this is familiar to other members, the third part of my remarks about the Canadian media ecosystem more generally. My campaign, like a lot of maybe local campaigns, just didn't get any local coverage.
I actually have more specificity, although I'm sure your local campaign was exhilarating. I want to go back to the Kathleen Wynne election. And from the outside looking in, the emergence of Ontario Proud under Jeff Ballingall, who we know to be a conservative staffer, somebody who has, created Canada Proud, is an owner in the post-millennial, and has been at the center of particular egregious examples of misinformation and disinformation. And I know that there was a fervor, second only to what I would see from this recent kind of iteration of the F. Trudeau culture that has been created on the far right. Can you speak to, from your experience, in whatever way you think appropriate to this discussion, ways in which you may have watched Ontario Proud use Facebook and other, although I think it was primarily Facebook, avenues to spread misinformation, disinformation, and I would say malinformation, if I could.
Yeah. So I was the Director of Policy and the Deputy Principal Secretary to the Premier of Ontario from 2011 to 2016. So I was there for the Premier Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, and I was the platform lead on the 2014 campaign. And at that time, frankly, these issues were not as pronounced. There was a media ecosystem there that was out there. There was online campaigning. People appeared to be getting information from a variety of sources, and mistrust and the toxic authoritarian populism that started to emerge in North America was not as apparent then. I will say, and this is primarily after I had left the Premier's office, but I know that definitely Premier Wynne faced a certain amount of personally directed hate, as did caucus members, as did, in fact, people from a variety of political and partisan persuasions as elected officials. While I wasn't involved in the 28 campaign with some of the events that you described, we actually did do a study in 2019 as part of the Facebook ad transparency work that we were trying to bring. We allied with a researcher that was bringing disclosure on who was being targeted with Facebook ads, and that, along with a number that was called Who Targets Me, that's still a project that's underway with our collaborators over in the UK and Ireland. And so we did a study at that time, not focused on the provincial election, but then which prompted that and other efforts prompted a pretty good Facebook political ad transparency registry that was created. And indeed, the entity that you described and a number of others with either generic names or names that weren't quite reflective of what they were actually promoting were some of the main buyers of online ads on Facebook in the 29 campaign. And I'll just leave it with the names of the organizations would not tell you with much specificity what they were actually about.
Well, I do know that there's a National Observer story that I think was in 2022 that linked phone numbers with people such as Angelo Isiduro, who Corporate Filings identified as a writer for the post-millennial, who made headlines when he resigned from Vancouver's NPA party after allegedly flashing a hand gesture associated with white extremism. I would say likely a Nazi salute. And he has, of course, through these findings, direct connections with Ballingal's company, Mobilized Media Group. And so if you could just talk a little bit about the way in which there is I would put it, threat of third-party advertisers, social media, and the ecosystem of misinformation and disinformation as it relates to electoral politics, particularly given the consideration that we've just seen an election in BC. We have them in the prairies. It's going to be coming to us federally. If you could just comment on that. I have about 45 seconds left.
Sure. I'll say this. There are a number of news outlets outlets that appear to be news outlets that are primed and designed to appeal to a younger demographic. The Buffalo News was mentioned in the Huck Commission's initial report. There are a number of outlets that, and with the Meta, Facebook, and Instagram news ban, there are new ones that are popping up. SixBuzz is a popular one amongst my students in the Greater Toronto area. So I'll observe that there are a number of sites that don't have the kind of editorial controls that you'd expect, that masquerade or that appear to be news sites or that have an agenda that are reaching larger audiences.
Okay. Ms. Bradshaw, I will come to you with that same question in my next round. It looks like I've run out of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. That does conclude our first round. We're going to do 5-5, 2.5, 2.5, and then we're going to conclude the meeting. We're going to start with Mr. Barrett for 5. Go ahead, sir.
So I'd like to refer to an ABC News article dated October 18, 2023. It says, U.S. says initial independent review shows no evidence of bomb strike on Gaza hospital. I want to read the first paragraph of this article. A day after the Hamas-led Gaza Health Ministry claimed Israel had attacked the Al-Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza City, saying some 500 Palestinians had been killed, Israeli and U.S. officials, explosive experts, and President Joe Biden said Wednesday, and available evidence shows the destruction was caused instead by a failed Palestinian terrorist rocket launch. I'm going to end the quote from that story there, but I would then like to refer to a tweet from 10/7/2023, and it's by Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, posted on X, and it says, quote, bombing a hospital is an unthinkable act, and there's no doubt that doing so is absolutely illegal. Now, that was viewed 2.7 million times, and I want to draw to your attention the context that existed at the time, and that goes back to this ABC article's opening graph that talks about that initial claim. And that initial claim was that Israel had perpetrated an attack on a civilian site, killing 500 civilians, innocents, in that war. And that was reported by mainstream news outlets across the West, including here in Canada. And many, if not all, issued some form of correction. But the tweet that I read to you from Canada's foreign minister, I just read that and wrote it down in the last 5 minutes. So that tweet is still up, viewed 2.7 million times. How harmful is this? It's frankly, it's recklessness from a government verified account. Now, on the platform X, there's different types of verifications, and one of them is from a government official or an elected official. This has the gray check mark. Talk about the disruption that foreign or hostile state actors they seek to create. And it's not necessarily to favor one political ideology or another. And I think, Professor Bradshaw, you talked about during a very contentious time in 2020 in the U.S., BLM riots, and the same hostile states were sponsoring or fomenting both supporters of BLM, but also supporters of Blue Lives Matter. So trying to create discord between two groups in a very tense situation, a tense time. So this example here, do you believe that this type of a failure to act after, a hot take, which can happen on social media, do you believe that it enables hostile foreign states to create the kind of division that, frankly, we've seen in Canada in the face of this this ongoing war in the Middle East? I'll start with you, Professor Bradshaw.
Yeah, so I don't remember the fact check story or anything like that. So I'm going to focus my response mainly on the role that I think influencers can play in the dissemination of mis and disinformation when we're looking at things like COVID misinformation, for example. It's really a small number of people who tend to generate the most engagement around like the conspiracy theories, and thinking about the role of people who have large audiences on social media. There's almost a greater incentive or a greater reason to, with great power comes great responsibility, kind of take more steps to ensure that fair and accurate and good information is going out to audiences. But platforms in particular have not traditionally taken that path. There have been a lot of, whistleblower documents that have shown specific kind of whitelists of accounts from people who are influencers who have large followings and can kind of get past a lot of the moderation systems because it generates engagement. And so for me, I think the problem is really there. And we should not be so worried about a Russian Twitter account that's not generating as much engagement and not reaching like mainstream public attention. But we should also be thinking more broadly about the role of influencers. And I also think that's why we see a lot of Russian information operations pivoting to hiring and co-opting local voices and people who already have audiences. If we're thinking about policy responses too, like generating that kind of trust and building a culture for influencers to do some defending of democracy could be a potential like positive route. But you also don't want to be paying them and do that kind of stuff. But you know what I mean.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry, Mr. Bardizzi, we didn't have time to go to you. Mr. Housefather, you have 5 minutes on this round.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the witnesses for being here. Professor Bradshaw, I read your paper about the 2020 election that you co-wrote with some others. And one of the things that struck me was the way that different platforms, you looked in particular at X and at Facebook, dealt with disinformation related to the election. Could you sort of just walk us through the issue where 30% of the posts were not treated, consistently by the platforms, and why that was?
Yeah, so this was a paper that used a really interesting data set of misinformation narratives that we had identified and reported to the platforms, and then we assessed whether or not they took action or did not take action against the content that was reported to them, and sort of checked by researchers to see, is this a misinformation narrative or not? And one of the things that explained the differences, some of them were really simple, technical fixes. For example, if we had reported a narrative, things that were on a certain date, things that were published before weren't necessarily backdated with a label, but things going forward were. We also noticed differences across the different kinds of media, and if things were screen grabbed or cut or edited slightly, the automated detection tools didn't always do a great job at identifying similar kind of misinformation narratives, because you have to remember a lot of this kind of content takedown is done automatically by automated systems. And so there was a couple of problems there. But, for the most part, we saw about 70% of the content being enforced, and a lot of the decisions to not enforce were relatively arbitrary based on these kind of small, technical problems or problems with the automated systems that I think could easily be fixed.
The allegation that there were pre-filled ballots, and when you had a picture of the pre-filled ballot, you would then have the content noted as being misinformation, but you wouldn't necessarily if they put up a video saying this. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, it really depended on like the particular narratives that we were looking at. I don't remember if that was an exact example, but that is kind of a good characterization of like some of the differences we were seeing.
They put together the election integrity, type of approach from the different social media companies in 2020. When we're looking at the upcoming Canadian election, what lessons should we learn that the Americans did right in 2020 or that the social media companies did well as they applied it to the 2020 election, and what did they do wrong?
Yeah, so in terms of really great lessons, I think a lot of the partnerships with academic institutions was a real success. Like it led us to be able to not only detect and brief the public real time on misinformation narratives that were occurring, but allowed us to do really interesting and novel research on the back end to sort of audit platform content moderation, something that's really, really difficult to do. In terms of things that could be done better, I think there was so much public and far right outlash against those kinds of initiatives, and universities didn't do well at necessarily protecting the researchers and the groups who were doing this really important work. And I don't think the platforms really did a lot to kind of protect those partnerships, and they're taking a step back from doing those kinds of collaborations now. And so I think that was a real harm, and something that, we could protect and create a more positive multi-stakeholder culture around.
Do you have any time, Mr. Chair?
30 seconds.
Oh. I'll pass that on to my Bloc and NDP colleague if one of them wants to take it. Thanks.
I actually may take that time
Okay,
at the end.
fine.
So,
then I'll pass it on to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather. Monsieur Villemure, 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Housefather. Take 12 months, there will be an election. Yes, currently happening. People. Secondly, are seeking to be two states are valid, even though they've been struggling, might not be.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bradshaw, you had probably listened into my exchange there. I know that you're Canadian, so you have context to this. My friend, Mr. Villemure, talked about kind of cognitive warfare. Steve Bannon, in fact, a chief far-right extremist strategist with connections to Canada's far-right extremist movement, talked about cognitive warfare. In essence, flooding the zone with a word that I can't say because it's unparliamentary. Could you comment on the ecosystem of third-party political actors, fake news, quite literally these fake online platforms that pop up? You can probably list, there's probably a dozen of them that I can think of off of 10. And then the online platforms that actually look like news. You talked about the Buffalo News, there's the Western Standard, there's a whole bunch of these far-right extreme outlets. How do average people sift through all of that stuff in an electoral cycle in order to make informed decisions based on the facts?
Yeah, certainly. So first, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the disinformation for hire kind of groups and how there is an industry kind of backing a lot of disinformation campaigns, which reminds us that we should not only focus on political and cognitive warfare, but recognize that a lot of these actors are incentivized. So not just platforms, but the creators of disinformation are incentivized to do so because they can generate advertising revenue or business deals with governments. And so thinking about policy responses could also think about raising the costs to engage in these kinds of activities by making them less profitable, taking, the typical kind of scam and fraud approaches and applying it to disinformation and these groups that try to generate advertising revenue by creating fake news stories and getting people to visit websites that show them ads. Like this is all kind of part of the broader ecosystem of challenges. And so when it comes to what citizens should do to navigate this complicated environment. I do think that we don't always give citizens enough credit for the diversity of media that they already consume. We don't just get our news from social media. It does play an increasingly important role, but so do our what we read in newspapers, what we watch on TV, who our social circles are, and who's kind of immediately around us in our community. All of these things play really important roles in terms of shaping our political knowledge and then therefore our behaviors. And so when we're thinking about solutions, like we can focus and home in on the social media angle, but we can also think about building more robust social institutions to empower people through different other kinds of media to have that diverse knowledge and to be able to generate their own kind of political knowledge and opinions.
Thank you. I definitely ran out of time. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you.
I know you were generous.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Ms. Bradshaw. En avant de poser ma question.
Before I ask my question, apologies, Mr. Bardizzi, you speak French very well.
I do have a question. None of this has been touched today, but we have heard from prior witnesses about the impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on the propagation of disinformation and misinformation. So I'm going to give you both an opportunity in a minute or less to share your thoughts with the committee on that. And I'll start with you, Mr. Bardizzi, if you don't mind.
Sure. So AI, Kevin Kelly was this internet kind of guru back in the day, says the internet is fundamentally a giant copying machine. And AI has the ability to create, copies of things at incredible speed and at incredibly low cost and incredible volume. I'm specifically concerned actually with AI-generated content on audio versus visual content. I think there's some evidence that audio content is harder to discern as being a deepfake. So that's one thing to be aware of, that as we prepare people around this issue, that we have a specific kind of line of inquiry about audio-related deep fake content. I also, though, commend to this group, Bruce Shiner, Harvard Kennedy School researcher, has this great little article, 16 ways that AI can be kind of useful or interesting for democracy. It's not all bad. There may be some specific uses around the edges of AI that could help us and help you do your jobs.
Okay.
But definitely area of concern.
Thank you. Ms. Bradshaw.
Yeah, +1 to everything Professor Bardizzi has said. For me, I think the greatest challenge with AI is the way that we talk about it in the public and in the media, because coming back to the idea of trust, when we're constantly telling people that they can't trust anything they see, read, or hear, we're not creating resilient citizens who are able to then effectively participate in society. And so I think being able to create digital literacy programs that generate, that don't build too much kind of like just overt skepticism, and that kind of like need to not trust anything that we read, see, or hear anymore, I think is really, really important going forward, because we do need some level of trust. So I'll end there.
Yeah. Interesting, because one of the things we have heard is exactly what you've talked about: critical thinking, digital literacy, and Finland has been used as the model for education in grade school. And I suspect, and I can't preclude any conclusions or recommendations of this committee, but that may be a big part of what we provide in terms of a recommendation going forward. So I want to thank you both for being here today, and I do invite you, if you have any afterthoughts, to submit them to the clerk, because oftentimes, as I said earlier, you walk away, you're sitting there in bed at night, I should have said this. Well, I'm giving you that opportunity. If you could provide that to the committee by 5 o'clock on Friday, that would be helpful. We like to have deadlines at this committee. Just for the sake of committee members, before I conclude, I just want to let you know that Thursday we have TikTok, Google, Meta, and X coming for this study, so prepare your questions, and that's it for today. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our technicians, clerk, analysts, and our witnesses. The meeting is adjourned.
quelque chose.
I'll start with an opening, and then I look forward to your questions. So we had written for an emergency debate. The Speaker accepted that request for an emergency debate tonight on the foreign interference, specifically related to the RCMP allegations of violence perpetrated by Indian government agents. So this is very serious, and I'm honored that we were able to get the Speaker to accept that today as something that necessitated an emergency debate. Only a week ago, we learned of these really chilling details of a foreign government hiring gangs to commit a campaign of terror impacting Canadians. But I am disappointed that the Liberals shut down our attempt to bring in a Canada-India Relations Committee, similar to the Canada-China Committee. What I'm disappointed by is that this is an ongoing trend I've seen with the Liberals. They put up barricade after barricade, block after block to pursue foreign interference. We had demanded a public inquiry, and you'll recall the government said no. Again and again, they put up barriers. They brought in a special rapporteur. We said that is not sufficient. That's not good enough. We had to fight that step at every step of the way to finally get a public inquiry. And now, when we're calling for a Canada-India Relations Committee to look at what's going on, to investigate what the threats are to Canadians, to really dig in and to do that important work, the Liberals again put up a blockade and said no. I know that the work of this committee may not look good on the Liberals and on their inaction. It may not look good on Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. But as the Prime Minister himself said, there are parliamentarians that are directly alleged to be involved, specifically, as the Prime Minister said, Conservative parliamentarians that are connected to foreign interference coming from the Indian government. That is serious. We need to take it seriously, and we need to do the important work of examining what's going on, ultimately because we need to keep Canadians safe. This is something that I've said again and again. This is a time that calls for us to put Canada first, party second. And I've seen both from Pierre Poilievre refusing to get a security clearance, refusing to do what's necessary to protect our democracy, and from Justin Trudeau, who is very slow in taking steps. We've seen both parties put their parties ahead of the country. I believe a leader needs to put the country first. And so we'll continue to fight hard to make sure we are protecting Canadians, we are protecting our democracy, we are keeping people safe. So I look forward to the debate tonight where we talk about what those steps need to look like, and I'll continue to push for a committee that will constantly look at, will be ongoing, looking at the relationship between Canada and India with a view to keeping Canadians safe. I'll do that in French, and then I look forward to your questions. Je suis honoré qu'on a demandé un débat d'urgence aujourd'hui et le président a accepté notre demande. C'est important parce qu'il y a une semaine que la GRC a partagé des détails tellement inquiétants de ce qui s'est passé avec l'ingérence de l'Inde, particulièrement une campagne de violence perpétuée par les agents de l'Inde. Ça, c'est quelque chose de conservateur. Leader is Liberals, I don't understand why, but putting up a barrier, stopping the important work of getting down to what's actually going on. How are Canadians being impacted, and what more can we do to protect Canadians?
Do you think the Liberals are trying to hide something?
I don't know why the Liberals would say no. I know the Conservatives seem like they're hiding something. They're unwilling to even know what's going on, and they're turning a blind eye. They're looking away from the heinous acts of a foreign government committing violence and criminal activity on Canadian soil. So that's clear from the Conservative behavior, but I don't understand why the Liberals would say no to this when it is an important step to have accountability, to keep Canadians safe, to dig into what's going on, how far is this, and how much more do we need to do to keep Canadians safe.
Last week, you didn't want to answer the question about whether you've received any threats personally. And then later in that same week, a story came out that your brother-in-law had been warned about threats to his safety. I'll ask you again if you can answer whether or not you face threats. And then also, do you feel like the Liberal government is taking threats to the Sikh community seriously?
Like I said, it's not about me, and so I'm going to focus on the threats that Canadians are faced with. I think it's really important to point out it is something that's truly a threat to all Canadians. When people are being
leadership of sellout Jagmeet Singh. This is a party that...
When I'm Prime Minister, I will keep my promises.
Everyone has an opinion about Canadian federal politics.
Oh, yeah.
Hey gang, what's up? Aaron, Canadian Loonie. In this one, we've got MP Michael Cooper kind of griping about the NDP Liberal coalition. He's pissed off. He had a long week. Cooper is fun to listen to, though. Like, he's pissed off. Let's take a look and a listen to why.
Rapper got the bill, and it's passing strange for a party like the NDP that has never been in government, hopefully never will be in government, that they're against members of Parliament being able to get their foot in the door to apply for a secret security clearance. I thought the NDP was all about accountability.
When I'm Prime Minister, I will keep my promises.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And while I fully respect your ruling on the scope of the amendment, at least that it is within scope on a technical basis, this really does add a whole new layer to what is a two-sentence, one-clause bill. I think it is important that we understand what the purpose and effect of the bill put forward by my colleague, Mr. Ruff, would be, because it seems, with the greatest of respect to some of my colleagues here in this committee, that it has been lost on some members. And it's not to say that concerns about protecting classified information, concerns around national security that they raised are illegitimate. They are legitimate. But they have really nothing to do with the purpose and effect of this bill if it were to come into law. And to that end, I would underscore that this two-sentence, one-clause bill would amend the Parliament of Canada Act so that every member of Parliament and senator can apply for a secret level security clearance. Nothing more, nothing less. That's it. It doesn't in any way provide that upon making an application that the member would therefore receive the security clearance. That would be left to the government. The bill doesn't change that. In the event that the member received the secret security clearance, it wouldn't provide that they would be entitled to access any information. That would be left again in the control of the government, and there are protocols in place around sharing such information with persons who have a secret security clearance. And information is shared to persons who have such a designation on the basis of a need to know. So the bill doesn't impact that. It simply provides that a member can get their foot in the door with respect to the application process. And the reason there is a need for this bill is because, as it stands, members of Parliament and senators are more or less unable to get their foot in the door unless they already have a security clearance from their prior careers, such as my colleague Mr. Ruff, who has a top secret level security clearance. He has a clearance as a result of his appointment to NSICOP, but prior to that he had such a clearance as a result of his service in the Canadian Armed Forces, and there are other examples of that. But there is something fundamentally wrong, in my opinion, that members of Parliament, 338 people, 338 Canadians elected to represent about 100,000 people that deal with matters of national security, foreign affairs, public safety, national defense, all falling within purview of what we do as members of Parliament, are somehow unable to even get our foot in the door to apply for not a top secret security clearance, but a secret security clearance. Difference between a top secret and secret security clearance, I mean, there are several distinctions, but one key aspect is a secret security clearance does not disclose sources and methods. But it does provide a member who might have that and might have be able to establish a need to know basis upon why they would like to have access to information, some further background, further understanding, which would actually provide in some of these issues that we have been facing on matters of foreign interference and so on, greater transparency to the member in a classified setting that could perhaps provide clarity and actually address concerns that might be raised where there isn't a basis, but the member might raise it because they can't, information that could help shed light on whatever concern they have, they don't have access to. 250,000 applications have been made in the last 10 years for a secret security clearance. 250,000. And Mr. Ruff, when he appeared to present on his bill, I asked him the question, how many secret security applications out of 250,000 have been turned down? And the number was under 10?
23.
23 out of 250,000. And somehow we have 338 members of Parliament that can't get their foot in the door, but of course ministers have security clearances, their staff have clearances, even interns in ministers' offices have clearances. But I, as a member of Parliament representing about 125,000 people, can't even get my foot in the door. How does that make sense? It doesn't. And so all Mr. Ruff's bill would do is to say, I can get my foot in the door, and then if I made that decision, I would have really my entire life examined to determine if I was trustworthy and any other concerns or red flags. And if I passed that, then I'd have a clearance. But again, a clearance is nothing more than receiving that accreditation. But I'd still have to establish a need to know, and it would still be within the control of the government to share anything with me. I could have such a clearance and have no information of a secret classified nature revealed to me. Now, you can have a discussion about issues and processes around how the government controls information, how it's shared, But that is, again, not the purpose of this bill. This bill has nothing to do with that. It is about as narrow in scope of a bill as one could draft, hence it being a 2-sentence, 1-clause bill. And so I would have thought that given how straightforward it is, and I would also add, given that it was in fact a unanimous recommendation of this committee that there be processes in place for members to be able to receive security clearances to better understand national security matters, and given I think NSCOP has weighed in. This has been raised at the National Inquiry on Foreign Interference. That this bill would have gotten out of committee after one meeting, quite frankly. But we heard, I think there's some members who seem to think it's funny.
Oh, that was something.
Oh, okay. No worries. Well, because I just don't find this very funny. I find it actually just dispiriting that, we have members insulting me. I think that just underscores the tone that we have and why this is so disappointing, because we have someone like Mr. Ruff, who has served his country in the Canadian Armed Forces for 25 years, who has a very good understanding of matters of national security, who has received a security clearance at the highest level and has held that for a number of years, who sits on NSCOP and therefore has a unique perspective as a member of Parliament. And we have certain members who don't have that background, don't have that experience, don't have that knowledge, who didn't even have the courtesy to talk to him, and table drop a bunch of sub-amendments that have nothing to do with his bill. Now, I will submit that there's one basis for that, and that is that they don't want this bill to pass. They would rather gut the bill, and it's passing strange for a party like the NDP that has never been in government, hopefully never will be in government, that they're against members of Parliament being able to get their foot in the door to apply for a secret security clearance. I thought the NDP was all about accountability.
Pretty funny. He's getting wound
now
up.
Under the leadership of sellout Jagmeet Singh.
Yeah, point of order from Ms. Matheson.
Here we go.
I'm really sorry that I made the member mad, but maybe he can focus back on the comments that he was going to make about the bill, as opposed to trying to insult in a sideways my leader. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooper, I didn't quite catch whatever exchange happened a few moments ago, but nonetheless, if you can keep your remarks, please, to the matter at hand. Thank you.
Under the leadership of sellout Jagmeet Singh, this is a party that.
Mr. Cooper,
you were told once
I have a
and asked once kindly.
everyone knows Jagmeet Singh is a sellout. And,
Okay.
and Mr.
All right.
Chair, going back to the supplement.
Mr. Cooper, I have the floor now.
Freaking funny, guys.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to suspend so that everybody can catch their breath, maybe have some water, maybe a bite to eat, maybe use the washroom, and we'll see where we get when we come back from that suspension.
Everyone has an opinion about Canadian federal politics. Oh, yeah. Right there, was that a filibuster by the Conservatives? Does MP Michael Cooper, a cowboy from Alberta, have a point to make? Sounds like it maybe is the case. I'm Aaron, Canadian Looney. Like, subscribe, share, get notified, all those fun things. It does help the channel, and come and watch one of the live shows. We watch this stuff daily. That's it. Thank you for watching this video. Catch you next one.
And since Trudeau's radical environment minister, who was sworn into cabinet, companies Cycle Capital own have received almost $20 million more from Justin Trudeau's billion-dollar green slush fund.
Everyone has an opinion about Canadian federal politics. Oh, yeah. Hey, gang, in this one, we've got Rick Perkins, an MP that I know personally. I used to work with Rick for like a dozen years at a company. It's interesting to see him as MP. He's exposing Minister of the Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, for, lining his pockets, doing what these liberals do. Let's take a look and a listen.
Breaking news from Ottawa, and this is really jaw-dropping, as we learn that Justin Trudeau's radical environment minister, Stephen Guilbeault, is profiting from Justin Trudeau's